So, Keir Starmer has bowed to what has long been inevitable and will resign as Prime Minister. Andy Burnham, having won a significant victory in Makerfield, will, it seems, stand unopposed to replace him. And by mid-July, Andy Burnham will be Prime Minister, and the Starmer era, which began just 2 years ago with over 400 MPs and a vast parliamentary majority, whimpers to a close. Political change can be brutal when it arrives. Starmer's authority drained away very quickly, and in the last few months, his ministry has been a rather strange exercise in waiting around for the next thing. It's hard to remember, I think, that enthusiasts not so long ago talked of not one but 2 terms of a Starmer government, and political obituarists now blame Starmer's character or his lack of political skill or his inability to read the country's mood. And those things are doubtless true, although they were visible flaws, I think, long before he entered number 10, if strategically ignored by many until convenient. But he's also the latest in a long line of prime ministers who have plummeted in public estimation on contact with office and who have left behind a rather indifferent legacy and a gradually worsening country. One might wonder, therefore, is Burnham likely to be any different? And why does this keep happening? Some wonder, of course, which Andy Burnham will walk into number 10. His political positions have certainly varied over the years. At points, he sounds like a radical. Time to end 40 years of neoliberalism, bring utilities under public control, change the electoral system and devolve power. Though the details, I think, sometimes shift a bit under pressure. And there are times when he seems rather close to the Starmer-Reeves approach, especially on the matter of fiscal rules. In the absence of a leadership contest of any kind, it's hard to know exactly where those mutable positions will end up really finally being fixed. And some people might think that there's something democratically problematic about a few thousand voters in Wigan and a few fixers at the top of the Labour Party deciding the next Prime Minister. But arguably, Andy Burnham is much clearer about what he wants and what he's going to do than most incoming prime ministers. The ministry is taking shape, but whatever enthusiasm has accompanied the Burnham victory is soon going to collide with some real political difficulties. The mood of the country orbits around the fact that everyone feels poorer all the time and with little expectation of change. The Starmer ministry has seen sporadic race riots and the rise, perhaps now faltering, of a very aggressive right populist party under Nigel Farage. There are revived political forces, of course, to the left of Labour as well. And there are only difficult decisions coming, not least the projected reduction in spending that the last couple of years of this Parliament will have to see. Not exactly a welcome inheritance. You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. I'm James Butler, and joining me to mark the passing of the mandate of heaven, Will Davies, who has a piece on the potential political economy of a Burnham government in the new issue of the LRB, and Patrick Maguire, one of the sharpest observers of Westminster, inter alia chronicler of the changing fortunes of the Labour leadership, and chief political commentator at The Times. And we're speaking on Monday, the 29th of June. Patrick's just been listening to Andy Burnham talk about devolving power, promising good growth in every postcode, and promising a huge council house building programme. Welcome both.
Hello, James.
Hello.
I want to start maybe just by dwelling on Starmer for a moment, because I think it's very easy, when political change happens to, skate over how remarkable and how rapid a downfall it is. I spoke a little about that there in the introduction. Patrick, how remarkable is it, or should we have seen it coming?
I think we could have seen it coming. Indeed, I spent most of 2024, including before the election, working on a book on Keir's rise to power. And one of the striking things about every conversation I had was that this man who was about to win a majority of historic proportions was a felt absence in every discussion about politics and policy and political direction. And it was clear even at that point that the public had never taken to him. He was, sort of a human constitutional lever to get rid of the Tories and effect change in that way. So knowing everything I did then, I wasn't surprised. Indeed, I was sort of waiting for the moment the wheels fell off because I thought they just couldn't not. But it is remarkable. And when I think back to the sort of conversations I was having with people who went into Downing Street the week before Labour won its landslide, so the campaign was entering its sort of glide path, its descent into office. And what I was hearing them say, they were already thinking in terms of the 2029 election. They were saying, well, this is the thing we're now thinking about. How do we win a second term in 2029? And maybe that was the problem. The Starmer project, such as it ever existed, or we should probably call it the McSweeney project, the Morgan McSweeney project, it looked inwards. It was about the battle for supremacy and struggle for mastery in and of the Labour Party. And it was an exercise in campaigning and self-definition and presentation. And so I think it's utterly unsurprising, actually, when I think back that given I was having those conversations about this is how we fight Nigel Farage in 2029, when a single submission hadn't gone into the new Prime Minister's office, or indeed he wasn't yet the Prime Minister, that was inevitable, because you pull back the curtain and there was very little there, not least a strong-willed executive with a plan and critique and a set of ideas.
And what do you make of that anxiety that seems quite prominent now among sort of members of the commentariat and perhaps a little more widely, that Britain does seem to eject, certainly since Brexit, has ejected a kind of series of prime ministers. They come into power, they plummet pretty rapidly and get the boot. That there hasn't been a sort of sustained ministry for a long time.
Well, let's take that in turn, because obviously if you look at it as a raw statistic, it's terrifying, right? 7 prime ministers in a decade. But let's take each of them in turn. Theresa May inherits a parliamentary majority of 12 from David Cameron and is embarked on the biggest constitutional undertaking of Britain has known, modern Britain has known, right? The unified post-1801 British state has known, right? So she needs a bigger majority. She loses her majority and ends up answering to the DUP and beholden to the most extreme ideological faction of her parliamentary party. So it is not surprising that Theresa May fails in that context. And yes, that's a Brexit-specific thing, but it's also a very conventional thing. She ran a terrible campaign in 2017, and Jeremy Corbyn ran a very good one. Boris Johnson wins a massive parliamentary majority, but is Boris Johnson and is brought low by a range of things. Disagreements on policy, yes. I think they're sometimes understated in analysis of Boris Johnson's premiership, but the classic Boris Johnson thing, standards, honesty. So that fails, and if it hadn't failed, I think people would be asking quite profound questions of the Conservative Party and its tolerance for that sort of thing. Liz Truss was Liz Truss. Liz Truss blows up Britain's standing in the bond markets. She blows up the pension markets, and she embarks on a huge economic experiment with no real mandate for it. Right, so that happens very quickly. But again, what was the alternative? And Rishi Sunak is ejected by the British people at the end of a cycle. So all of those things, I think, are readily explicable. The Keir Starmer thing, I think, does reveal something about our political culture. And it's something I was just listening to Andy Burnham address in what sounded like a strident way, but it was actually quite subtle. What Keir Starmer was incapable of doing at the end of the day was leading and making political arguments. You listen to a Keir Starmer speech, it is a series of observations. It's often a sort of anguished, quite stroppy meta-commentary on how difficult it is to be Keir Starmer. It's sort of this trying to win arguments or saying he's won arguments without engaging in the intellectual hard graft of making them. And in that context, with that vacuum of leadership at the top, without a clear strategic direction, with a leader who was sometimes in the same sentence occupying wildly different positions within Labour's intellectual, factional traditions, it was always, it's unsurprising that lots of other things filled the vacuum. And that's to say nothing of their heavy-handed, sometimes sadistic party management. So, that tells you something, yes, about how easy it is. We could draw that conclusion from that, the Labour Party is ungovernable. The Labour Party can't take tough decisions. MPs are flighty and they're scared when they get a dozen angry emails from their constituents on the winter fuel allowance or Gaza or whatever. I actually think all of this is a reminder of the need for clear and decisive political leadership. And listening to Andy Burnham just now saying, we need a more collaborative culture, we need to loosen the whip, it can't be an instrument of fear and coercion. all of which will be music to the ears of Labour MPs who want to be listened to. But there was a line in there slipped in almost imperceptibly, and it's the standout line of the speech for me, which is the political direction I set, I, first person singular, will not be up for debate. The difference with Keir Starmer was he was never setting the political direction. It was Rachel Reeves, it was Morgan McSweeney, it was whoever else. And there was constant debate about it, because not least the debate often happened in between different versions of Keir Starmer, be that 2020 or this interview or that interview or this speech or that speech. So I can understand why people look at 7 prime ministers in 10 years and think, oh God, we've become we're now the sort of proverbial Italy of modern politics. But I think under-indexed in all of this is the role of leadership, and that is the big defining test for Andy Burnham, I think.
And I think that there's one thing you said there that I think is, it's been a question that I've been thinking about as Starmer has been on the way out, is what the tipping points were, because this is an important one for anyone who wants to manage the Labour Party. The winter fuel payments was clearly a moment at which something broke. I think that the controversy over welfare cuts to disabled people, personal independence payment, these are things that are sort of morally very difficult for people in the Labour Party. 2-child cap as well, really, really, really significant.
Yes.
Lots of people on the left of politics want to think that Gaza is the thing that morally discredited him. I think there's an element of that that's true. But I wonder whether that's really that strong an element in the party itself.
I would agree, actually, for several reasons. The first is, it does morally discredit him, and it discredits him with a really reliable chunk of Labour's base. Look at the 2019 result. Lots of, they call it the Red Wall. Lots of seats in Britain's, old mill towns fell to the Tories. Where does Labour hold on, right? Labour loses, what is the difference between Labour losing a coalfield seat and holding on to an old mill town in Oldham? Or, look at indexes of deprivation. Why does it hold on to this seat or that seat? Often, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but only a bit, it was because British Muslims, Pakistani communities, Kashmiri communities, that sort of thing, were willing to vote for the Labour Party because it was their party. Gaza changes that. And that's a problem for Keir Starmer. You see the election of the 4 independent MPs in places like Birmingham and Blackburn and Leicester in 2024. That is an early warning sign, and obviously Jeremy Corbyn is into North as well. That's an early warning sign that, and this becomes clearer and clearer, that the McSweeney project, i.e., you subscribe to the Mandelson theory that Labour's core vote has nowhere else to go, and you unsettle them and discomfort them because that's the price you pay to pursue voters elsewhere. That's an early warning sign. That doesn't work. Keir Starmer's stance on Gaza is alienating Labour's actually existing core vote, not the sort of sentimentalized, imagined one that they're trying to win back. And that becomes clearer and clearer with the rise of Polanski and Gorton and Denton by-election this year. And every electoral event proves that Labour's actually existing core vote is turning away from the party, and it's shrinking and it's shrivelling at the same time as reforms rise, showing you that whatever the strategy is, it isn't working right. So Gaza destabilises the party and delegitimises the Starmer-McSweeney approach in that way. But it also does something important to the Parliamentary Labour Party, right? This October the 7th, 2023, and its aftermath. Keir Starmer's response to that is pretty cack-handed. It alienates large swathes of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And all of a sudden, what does it do? I think it reawakens the Parliamentary Labour Party, who at that point are broadly acquiescent. They are swallowing whatever they're being fed by the leadership of the Labour Party because power is just on the horizon. And suddenly they wake up again. They realise that they rediscover their gag reflex politically, and that I think reintroduces rebellion and dissent as a legitimate thing in the Labour Party, and it sort of reminds them actually as well that whatever the Starmer project is, it is not based on engagement with Labour MPs. I remember, and you can overdo that, of course. I remember writing at the time, ask a sort of median backbencher their model for leadership, they'd say it's, can we run the party like the editorial collective of Spare Rib or something? Like, we all should be able to decide the direction. Obviously, it's not really a practical way to run a political party, particularly, in Westminster. But it sort of reminded them that actually, we do have a say, we do have agency. We are not remote controlled drones or automatons. And, it also is the first time, I think, and you see this again on Two Child Cap, the left, the parliamentary left and the broader left have had Keir Starmer and Morgan Sweeney's boots on their necks for a long time, and all of a sudden rediscover that they can speak from the moral high ground, that they are allowed to do that. And that was, I think, a big, important psychological moment, and it set in train critiques on a range of other things. So I think it was a really, really important moment.
Well, let me bring you in here, and this is a nice way to transition, I guess, from Starmer to Burnham, which is, obviously, there's been lots of criticism for the Starmer government's underachievement in various ways, but governments do change things about countries. Burnham is going to inherit a series of commitments and policy measures from his predecessor. What does that look like for him? What legacy has the Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves administration left for Burnham to take on?
Well, I think, Rachel Reeves, obviously as Chancellor, and I think this did also infect the wider Starmer project for some of the reasons Patrick's outlining. There was a huge awareness of initially the Tories' fiscal legacy. And that, I think, also really shaped particularly the early months of how Starmerism was communicated and experienced as a rather kind of dismal set of excuses that we can't do things at the moment. But of course, I think one of the things that probably gets forgotten about actually in these conversations sometimes is there was this incredibly bold budget in the autumn of 2024, which was the highest tax-raising budget since 1993, which unleashed a lot of spending for the NHS and quite a lot of public investment in infrastructure and so on, obviously all within the fiscal rules that Burnham has been very clear, initially less clear, but increasingly clear that he is going to respect. And I think he also hammered that point home in the speech in Manchester today. So he's going to clearly try to sustain what has become the fiscal orthodoxy in this country, particularly with the shadow of the trust disaster hanging over people. And I think that means that in order to not simply go around arguing about fiscal trade-offs and constantly trying to confront backbenchers about what can and can't be afforded. And the other example, of course, where backbenchers, which Patrick didn't mention, but really did end up being able to manipulate policy, was over the welfare reforms as well, which was an extraordinary state of affairs where a party with that scale of majority is unable to get quite an important fiscal the fiscal policy that they wanted to get through Parliament, unable to do so. There's also, of course, the question, which I saw he gave an interview with the Times recently. Was that actually with you, Patrick? I can't remember, where he talked about how there was going to he was going to spend, well, the headline anyway actually that was extracted was that he was willing to spend more on defence and less on welfare, which was again an attempt to try to signal that balancing the books, and in a time where we're the threat of Russia is increasing, that he was going to be a fiscal conservative. So all of that's going on in the background. I think that for that reason, I think that part of the case for shifting attention towards some of this, what is, of course, it has a lot of fiscal implications, but this devolutionary agenda that he is so keen to promote is partly a way of defining himself in ways that doesn't simply come down to the kind of treasury mentality of of moving money around on balance sheets. And I think that he does now speak this language of partnership, this language of taking back public control, but not necessarily a full nationalisation of various utilities. So clearly the way that he wants to present himself as a move beyond, whether you call it Thatcherism, neoliberalism, Blairism and so on, is to be much more critical of some of the failures of privatization, and he uses his example, his precedent of the Manchester bus network to demonstrate what he's done in the past and what could be done with all sorts of other public services and public utilities. But I think that one of the big questions will continue to be, well, first of all, who's going to be the Chancellor, but also what kind of devolutionary agenda is possible when it doesn't involve trying to bring people on board with things by simply offering more and more money. Because, I mean, New Labour had its version of a devolutionary agenda with things like the Northern Way and the sort of stuff that John Prescott was pushing in the late 90s and early 2000s. And of course, that was not a time of splashing huge amounts of cash around. But one of the ways in which it did try to work was to use use centralised fiscal policy in order to divert particular forms of regional development plans and that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what that looks like in a time when there simply is not, sticking within these fiscal rules and not raising taxes means that there isn't going to be a huge step away from the Starmer-Reeves fiscal inheritance.
You're absolutely right to put your finger, Will, on Treasury orthodoxy. And listening to that speech then, and there were several dutiful nods to it. He spoke about the importance of sound money and Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules. But I listened to him describe Number 10 North, which is his plan for an outpost. The sort of temples of decentralisation moved part of Number 10 to Manchester. But he set out its mandate, and he said it will be responsible for three things. The first will be reindustrialisation. The second will be regeneration of places. And the third is reform of Britain's essential utilities, water, energy, transport, so that they're under greater public control. And I listened to that and I actually thought, this isn't really Number 10 North at all. It's not really a Number 10 thing. It is sort of basically a version of, it's breaking up the Treasury, or rather setting up a counterweight to the Treasury in the North. Because if you think about all three of those things, let's take energy into public ownership, let's reindustrialise, give state aid to Scunthorpe, let's spend money regenerating, the Chesterless Street or Blythe or whatever. They're the sorts of initiatives that any minister puts into the Treasury and they say, no, sorry, the ROI on that is terrible, or, the numbers don't add up. So really, it's sort of like almost like a version of Wilson's DEA or something. It's breaking up the Treasury, putting it in the North, slapping a flat cap on it, or, giving it Boddington's branding. It's actually sort of quite a deceptively radical way of bringing that agenda forward. It sounds like, Andy Burnham is setting up an office so he can get back to Wigan a bit more quickly at the weekend. But actually, if that mandate is delivered on, it's a really quite profound and bold and radical thing if they get anywhere near running those policies out of that, because it's a big threat to Treasury authority, which, as you say, Will, I think is the defining thing Andy Burnham's going to need to break through if he's going to make good on the stuff he's been talking about.
Which was also, I refer in my LRB piece to this article. Actually, there was about 2 or 3 in the same issue of Renewal by Louise Hay about a vision of Burnhamism, basically, or Manchesterism. And in one of them, I think it's called A New Fiscal Framework, because there's also another one as well in the same journal by her. But she talks about precisely this, that the budget setting powers of the Treasury need to be, the Treasury will carry on having various responsibilities within Whitehall, and it will carry on being the agency that is borrowing money from the bond markets, and it has this very, very powerful position within the UK's financial sovereignty. But in terms of actually being able to decide who gets what in particular areas, that she's recommending that some of those powers, she was saying, need to be taken within Number 10. But you're right that taking them into not only outside of the Treasury but outside of London is another is another way of doing that in quite a radical way. Of course, one of the big questions in all of this is how do you raise capital once it's no longer being done through the conventional means of the Treasury selling gilts on the bond market? Is it possible for some of these sorts of new what you might call public interest companies or public corporations or these sorts of things, that there's been a lot of talk about this kind of thing by various voices around Burnham. And some of these ideas have been around for a long time. People like Will Hutton were talking about some of this stuff 30 years ago. And one of the hopes, I think, is that some of these sorts of entities could go directly to the bond markets or other forms of financial innovation, or however you want to put it, different types of financial instruments they might be able to sell. And that way, would it be possible to raise capital without adding to the public debt? I mean, that, after all, was one of the arguments initially in favour of the privatisation of university tuition, was that you might be able to put all of that university debt off balance sheet, which was then, it was the Office for National Statistics that changed its mind about that. And so you've got a lot of those sorts of questions about exactly how much devolution can you get from the Treasury without it looking like a form of a sort of an accounting trick in some regards. But the politics of it, absolutely, it's very radical.
You're listening to On Politics on the LRB podcast. Stay with us as we take a very short break. I thought one of the things that was interesting about the speech today was there was an explicit acknowledgement of the benefit of universities within the British economic system, which is not something we've heard from government for a while. So perhaps
I wondered, actually, the announcement of James Purnell, who was former Vice Chancellor of the University of the Arts London, I mean, could be. I mean, and Purnell is sort of someone who makes no bones about. I mean, I'm not sure he would describe himself as part of the metropolitan elite, but he's not embarrassed to be part of a certain section of the Labour right, I guess. But also he doesn't carry around that kind of blue Labour baggage that we need to sort of get back to flat caps and whippets and so on. And it could actually be quite good news for things like universities to have people like that inside the administration.
Yeah, I mean, that's just to say for listeners who might not have kept up with it, that's James Purnell, who's been announced as Burnham's Chief of Staff. And Purnell himself has a long background in Labour politics in the last Labour administration, in fact, the previous Labour government. So a controversial figure, I think, in some ways. Also unusually, I think, quite advanced in years for a Chief of Staff, very demanding job. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think he and Burnham have a long-standing relationship, so there's some kind of strong trust there. I don't think they agree on everything. Also an interesting choice, a confident choice. That allows us actually to talk a little bit about the political mechanics here, because we've talked about some pretty broad and some pretty substantive reforms to the country, but we're almost halfway through a parliamentary term. There's not that much governing time left. Doing these things, one of the things I think that Starmer and Reeves have discovered is that big infrastructural changes might have political consequences in the long term, but they take a while to arrive. There are some good things that this government has done. NHS waiting lists are down. Small boat crossings have fallen quite significantly. Don't think anyone's actually noticed that in terms of the political debate yet, but it's a thing that has happened. So there is, I guess the question I'm asking is about kind of political staging, right? I think lots of these conventions are artificial, or they arise from the press, but there will be a hunger for a kind of 100 days of Burnham story. What's he done in that time? Patrick, is what's going to be high on his agenda when he walks into number 10? Are there things that he can do pretty much immediately that will make a very clear, kind of distinct, policy-wise, sort of substantive and, I guess, tangible change for people in the country?
Well, his biggest critique is cultural, and presentational. So they're not policy changes, but the mere fact of being Andy Burnham and not being Keir Starmer is an immediate signal of change. Yeah, and I think that difference is really pronounced. Having listened to lots of Keir Starmer speeches and listened to that Andy Burnham speech, it is night and day in terms of presentation. Even if we are not a million, I was actually texting a former advisor to Keir Starmer during that speech, and they were saying, almost admiringly, this is so similar to the sort of stuff I used to hear him say at cabinet away days when he had the cabinet at Chequers, and the critique he would make of politics in private, and that which they had tried to get him to advance always unconvincingly. But they said, this sounds like a completely different speech and worldview because of the manner of the delivery and the man doing the delivery. So that'll be that's obviously a big thing, right? But, put that aside, that is obvious. The interesting thing for me, and these are conversations I've been having over the last week too, Andy Burnham can pick up several bits of this government's agenda and run with them, with cosmetic tweaks or judicious amendments. I'll give you 2 examples. There was a story buried in The Guardian on Saturday about the Ministry of Housing setting up or considering setting up a state-owned house builder because they are frustrated with the laggardly pace of building by private developers. So Steve Reed is already considering that, the Housing Secretary. Listen to Andy Burnham. He wants a new generation of council housing. He wants intensive development. He wants more social housing. He thinks the emphasis of this government's planning policy or its building policy has been wrong. But he doesn't need to go in or get a new housing secretary if he wants to replace Steve Reed, or he doesn't have to read the right at Steve Reed and say, you need to change your policy. The policy is already there. Ditto, there's a water bill making its way through Parliament, or about to make its way through Parliament, that gets you most of the way or very close to Andy Burnham's definition of public control. You might need to insert a few new clauses, or if you're Andy Burnham, you might or may well have the confidence in your ability to make a political argument and declare a victory, a bit like Mandani's been doing in New York. You say, this is my objective. You make an iterative argument and you say, in the end, you're giving credit for delivering something that you can define against the standards of your campaign. It's not exactly the same thing, but everyone's seen you grafting for the change and you've delivered it, and you're doing it in a personable, affable, sort of happy warrior sort of way. So those are 2 examples of things Andy Burnham could do in his first 100 days or whatever cliched frame you want to do, and just say, look, I told you I would do this. I'm doing it. And no one's going to, no one out there is going to say, well, hang on, you're just picking up Keir Starmer's policy, because it'll be part of Andy Burnham's defining argument. The big question, obviously, is what happens at the budget and what is the big ticket change he makes at that point, because he will want there to be one, but he's running out of time to think about that. And he's obviously at the mercy of global events and headwinds there. But I'd say on the domestic front, there'll be a lot of picking up and repackaging and renovation going on. Like adding sort of flying buttresses to a church or something.
I mean, just I guess the question about this in some ways is it really does pivot around who ends up in number 11, right? And do you have a sense where that is going to land? I mean, there's lots of screaming about Ed Miliband at the moment from every side, I think. There's a nice piece by Duncan Robinson in The Economist from a little while ago that declares Ed Miliband the secret prime minister, that really what he does determines the direction of government in one way or another. I think that's an interesting way to look at it, perhaps not entirely true, but it's striking how influential and how panicked many people are about the possibility of a Miliband chancellorship. Other contenders, names get mentioned here, there, and everywhere. It's pretty clear Reeves isn't going to stay. Who's your money on?
I just had this exact conversation with the exact same framing with a colleague in the speech, and I said, if you were a bookmaker and you gave me a £5 promotional free bet to wager on the Chancellor appointment at this stage, I would, with sort of medium confidence, put it on Ed Miliband. And I might be completely wrong. The big difference about this debate, by the way, is that unlike when I would have these conversations with advisors to Keir Starmer and intimates of Keir Starmer and allies of Keir Starmer, it was always a case of, this is what we're going to try and get him to do. And, your sense was actually the worst person to ask at any point would be Keir Starmer, because he probably wouldn't know. He wouldn't have decided. He'd be waiting for someone to tell him. Whereas the only person who knows for certain in all of this is Andy Burnham. Yes, people are trying to bring their influence to bear, and there are different parts of his operation, his circle, have very different views on this, but nobody knows apart from Andy Burnham. There are 2 credible contenders, I think. Certainly the people who figure most in the conversation that I'm having. One, as you say, is Ed Miliband, and 2 is Shabana Mahmood. Shabana Mahmood, her sense, whatever her political economy is, isn't particularly well defined, but the case for them at its root is the same. They are both proven to be ministers who are capable of, in the view of people around Andy Burnham, smashing through vested interests, of gripping a department and bending it to their will, and sort of blocking out opprobrium about their policy choices and pursuing an agenda ruthlessly. Now, I think regardless of what you think of either the net zero policy or Shabana Mahmood's immigration policy, I suspect LLP readers will probably have a stronger view on one than the other. you can't deny both of them have done that. And if Andy Burnham wants to deliver big change immediately, that's the question, or wants to be seen delivering big change. What does Ed Miliband have the edge over Siobhan Mahmood? Well, Treasury experience, a defined sense of political economy, and he's the person helping him develop economic policies. Possession is often 9/10 in politics. Let's see, there are lots of people who don't want him to be Chancellor, but that's the sort of minister he wants, and sort of it applies as readily to Mahmood in general, maybe not specifically to the Treasury, as it does to Miliband. So it's telling, I think, that those are the two favourites, or those are the two main runners and riders for this job.
We're talking about a sort of relatively senior generation of Labour politicians at the moment. Obviously, there is a new generation on the benches at the moment, some of them with pretty thin majorities. Are there people to have an eye on? There have been people who've become increasingly prominent. I mean, I think Al Carnes, who was a defence minister and former soldier, which always gets a certain segment of the Labour selectorate going. But people like, say, Yuan Yang, who has a kind of very strong heterodox economic background. Obviously, Torsten Bell, strong sort of background in the Resolution Foundation. There are various people there who might look attractive, I think, to a Burnham ministry. Do we have any sense that they're in conversation?
Yeah, I think those are two. You've put your finger on two interesting, I think, names. Two interesting names that are definitely people to watch. I think this is boom time. If not for the British economy, but politically for people who have interesting economic ideas and are willing to look afresh at the great imponderables or the great untouchables of British political and economic debate. Those two MPs in particular, Torsten Bell has obviously not really been the sort of Resolution Foundation's vicar on earth as a minister, but if you have a track record of thinking creatively about the economy, this is the sort of government that will take you more seriously. I think it will prove to be that sort of government than Rachel Reeves's Treasury might have done.
Well, you've mentioned Louise Haigh and her articles in Renewal, but one of the other influences you mention in that piece for the paper is Commonwealth and Matthew Lawrence, who has, of course, been a guest on this podcast. Listeners can go back and hear him talk about that report, which is apparently being widely read among Burnham's people. Does this feel like an incoming government that is more intellectually open and keener to find some of those resources than Starmer's?
Yeah, I think it clearly is. I mean, I think that you couldn't be much less, I think, is the truth. I mean, in some ways, I guess it has a slight feel maybe of the early days of the Biden administration in that respect, where there was a real sense after Trump won that the Republic was in danger, really. There was talk of Biden holding seminars with historians when he first got in to talk about what to do. And obviously there was this incredibly lavish fiscal agenda known as Bidenomics that followed. Britain is incapable of that level of fiscal largesse as its response to political crisis. But it seems to me from afar, I don't talk to people in the way that Patrick does, but as a sort of observer, that there is, I think, a sense. I mean, we have, after all, people have been talking about there's the existential threat to the Labour Party that was being talked about during the local elections in May. But I think there's also it's true, of course, that Farage seems to be struggling all of a sudden. But I do think there's a sense that when you look at some of the kind of opinion polls, when you look at the way in which media consumption habits are changing, you look at the threat of people like Elon Musk to Britain's information environment and some of the political ramifications of that Britain is facing really quite a serious potential fork in the road. And that is a time for ambitious ideas to be given a proper hearing. And of course, there are still real constraints to what can be done. But it does seem to me that there is a recognition that the 2029 election could be a very serious one historically. And I think that has led to a widening of intellectual appetite. I mean, after all, Burnham himself as a former special advisor. It's interesting because Starmer. You think about it, obviously Starmer's one of his terrible mistakes that we didn't talk about was the whole Mandelson affair, and that was used as evidence that Starmer was just too addicted to a kind of Blairite New Labour agenda, and that if only he was a bit more kind of ambitious or a bit more intelligent, maybe he wouldn't have done that. But in some ways, I mean, Burnham has been around the Labour Party for far longer. Starmer only entered Parliament in 2015, and he was leader within 4 and a bit years later. You could then say that the sort of turn towards the dark arts of Mandelstam was partly a symptom of not really having much, so many political resources and judgment and imagination at his fingertips. There are a lot of ideas floating around. I mean, I think that they haven't got near number 10 during the Starmer administration. And you take so back to the case of Commonwealth and Matthew Lawrence's ideas. I mean, I think those ideas would have been seen as outside of the Overton window, if you want to put it like that, during the through most of the last 2 years. I don't know exactly. I mean, I talk a bit about them in my piece, and people can read them on that's been published by the new mainstream group that has been founded by Neil Lawson as a kind of new voice of the soft left. And it's a pretty radical critique of British capitalism in terms of the propensity for rent-seeking, price gouging, exploitation of basic human needs in sectors such as care, the role of private equity, this kind of thing. It's extremely critical of where British capitalism got to, and it's extremely ambitious as to what it would what it would take to alleviate some of those pathologies. But I do think that there's a sense that just carrying on business as usual simply is not going to be good enough. And I think everyone kind of intuits that. And that, after all, is what a lot of voters are saying on doorsteps as well.
Right. And it feels a lot like there's the opportunity to do what perhaps Rachel Reeves should have done when she arrived in number 11 and say, right, things are so much worse than we expected. Actually, everything is on the table. Let's do something serious here. I wonder about kind of flashpoints, and I wonder about kind of the obstacles here. And I mentioned very briefly at in the introduction the spending envelope, which there is a commitment to reducing the spend by the end of this Parliament in non-ring-fenced departments quite significantly. That's a difficult thing to realise. You can certainly let inflation eat some things in cash terms. I imagine that's probably on the agenda. But it just doesn't seem possible to me that a sitting Prime Minister is going to walk into an election, and so significant an election, as I think you rightly identify, having spent a year cutting things beforehand. It just doesn't seem likely to me. It just seems like a mad possibility. So that's sort of coming down the line, and that's a difficult one to know how to fund and put together. And I just wonder whether there's a kind of advantage of backwardness here, that actually the British state has been quite so bad for so long that there are models elsewhere that we can look to. You've mentioned Bidenism, you've mentioned the sort of early kind of Biden IRA stuff. Are there others? Are there other international examples to look at here?
Well, I mean, one of the things that has already been mooted, which would be pretty radical, I wonder whether this could be the sort of thing that was part of the kind of big first 100 days or big budget announcement, but it's suddenly been talked about in the media in a way that I haven't seen before, which is the idea of the basic law borrowed from Germany. So after the reunification of Germany, a law was passed which effectively set a new test that fiscal policy, I believe, could be judged in terms of the extent to which it was narrowing regional inequalities. Now, this is, this will be used as a way of saying that this is now a kind of almost an anti-London type of administration or something like that. But I mean, there are different types of measures which, that's one of the things that's already been introduced. I think, again, with lots of these things, having greater devolution, including elements of fiscal devolution, does mean that I guess that there's a lot of rage and anger in our society, and there's a lot of anti-political sentiment in our society, and it just seems to be ratcheting up more and more and more. I suppose part of I'm not saying this is the thinking behind devolution, but perhaps part of the reason why devolution seems to speak to the moment right now is that at the moment that all of that rage and anger gets kind of channeled directly at a bunch of professional politicians in London, and pushing some power, including certain fiscal powers, away from Westminster, of course, there ought to be a better vision of democracy than just simply kind of being irate and hating on various people in positions of power. But I think that could be part of a vision. But of course, the extent to which that gets Labour out of trouble at a time of fiscal tightening with an election on the horizon is a whole other question. But I'm not aware of them going and studying particular national models, but of course it's been known for decades that Britain has a far more centralised political system than many countries.
Patrick, I want to bring you in just to think maybe a bit about the changes to the political system as a whole, which this all goes. So we've talked a lot about the Labour Party and the position of Burnham in the Labour Party, and I think there are interesting things to be said there. He's recognisably more of a Labour politician than Starmer. He sits in kind of clearly identifiable Labour traditions, several of them, in fact. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about him is that he does have various kind of traditions flowing into his positions. But obviously, changes in Prime Minister have effects across the whole political system. And, a couple of times in this conversation, I've mentioned the difficulty that Farage has found himself in the last couple of by-elections. I mean, it's not like the reform vote, has not been a bad vote. So I don't, I think it can be overstated that the degree to which he's collapsing, but perhaps he's found quite a hard ceiling. I'm interested in your sense of what it means actually for the block of progressive voters and politicians who are, effectively retailing to them. And the obvious case here is Zach Polanski, who obviously has profited quite handsomely, I think, from disgust with Keir Starmer and quite transactional attitude on part of voters saying, okay, well, the Labour Party is no longer expressing the politics that I want the Green Party is. I don't feel a kind of tribal affection in that sense. So I wonder what you make of the impact on him, and perhaps, and it's a listener pointed out to me the other day that I really don't mention the Liberal Democrats on this podcast very often, and they have a good number of MPs, and there are districts in which they harvest that progressive vote as well. So what do you think of the effect on those people who are vying for votes in that progressive bloc?
Yes, I think if I were a Green strategist, I would be not necessarily worried about Andy Burnham, but I'd be thinking hard about everything we're hearing from Andy Burnham and what we saw in Makerfield. Because if you can, the Greens keep their deposit in Runcorn, where there's a by-election last year that Reform win by 6 votes. And to this day, people who work for Nigel Farage say the Greens won them that by-election. And they were worried about a similar thing happening to them in Makerfield, incidentally, that Rupert Lowe's Restore Britain would be the Greens of that by-election, as having a Runcorn effect there, but in the end it didn't matter. But compare the Green vote in Runcorn, again, demographically quite similar to Makerfield, certainly not particularly friendly to the Greens as a sort of winnable proposition, but they're nowhere. They poll in the low hundreds. And if Andy Burnham is capable of presenting himself as palatable to the broad block of progressive voters, there was always a big question, and some people around Keir Starmer were optimistic that even Keir Starmer could have united the progressive bloc at the next election. I was never sure because I was actually really sceptical of that because of just how deeply offensive and morally reprehensible, I don't think that's too strong a word, that some voters in that section of the electorate clearly find Keir Starmer for a number of reasons, and the low trust there. I think if any Labour politician is going to unite the broad left or turn out the progressive bloc against a divided right, and we still will have a divided right, by the way, I think that's one of the things that I personally was wrong about. At the start of this year, I thought the Tories were going to inevitably be squeezed by Reform, and that momentum is all with Reform. But clearly, the Tories are going to survive as a sort of a sectional party rather than a national party, a party that has strong credibility on a range of issues, a range of sort of special issues or with special interest groups, and among quite a socioeconomically narrow stratum of society that is sort of unevenly distributed across the country. So it's a party that can win council elections in Wandsworth and by-elections in the petro city of Aberdeen, but is not in contention in broad swathes of the country, right? And they've become a sort of liberal Democrats of the right. They appeal to a section of affluent Britain. But the big question for me, you're right to bring up the Liberal Democrats. Are those the 72 Liberal Democrat seats, were they won by frustrated progressives who never sort of, their votes never counted before, or outraged and disgusted Tories who wanted to kick their party and found the Liberal Democrats inoffensive? They found the Liberal Democrats a blank canvas onto which to project their democratic outrage. They thought they were the embodiment of Middle England, and they also didn't find Keir Starmer threatening. Is that calculation? The Liberal Democrats traditionally do badly when, in their modern iteration, when the Labour leader is not trusted by that sort of median voter in a place like Tunbridge Wells, etc., etc. Are the voters of Tunbridge Wells going to think, I'm happy to vote Liberal Democrat this time because because I like Andy Burnham, or will they feel threatened by Andy Burnham and think they want to vote for Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives instead? Or actually, have they just been separated from the Tories on a values basis? They don't see themselves as Tories anymore because they, since Brexit, since Boris Johnson, since Liz Truss, the Tory party has come to be seen as the embodiment of values that aren't theirs. I mean, these are big questions, but they're worth considering. But yeah, I think where do the Greens find a gap here in the national conversation, especially given Andy Burnham has appropriated some of the language of economic populism? Somebody described this to me. It's almost like, that they're using this sort of vaccine theory of populism. The Labour Party is injecting itself with a little bit of populism in the hope it makes itself immune to more virulent strains. It's sort of Edward Jenner populism, right? Let's see if it works. But clearly, if you listen to what Andy Burnham is saying, especially using words like hope, where does Zach Polanski, a member of the London Assembly, not the Prime Minister, not someone with a big track record of delivery, where does he find a gap?
I think one of the interesting parts of that answer is the question of sort of presentation and affect, and it's one of the things that has run through our conversation is, one of the things that matters and really significantly politically matters about Burnham is that he feels different to Starmer. It's really, really clear. Any of the interviews done with voters up in Wigan, in Makerfield, in that constituency, it's tangible that these things matter in a way that I think those of us who focus on, say, economic policy and the sort of nuts and bolts of political change or constitutional change can undervalue. Yes. And for me, it brings up one of the things I think, Will, you were alluding to at various points, that there is quite a roiling and agitated and vituperative mood in the country. It's one that's very unpredictable. It's one that clearly erupts. I mean, we've seen it sort of 2 summers in a row. There have been these kind of very, very sort of deeply disturbing riots. Do you have a sense of how that's working politically, where it's rooted, where it's coming from, and is the sort of the presentation of Burnhamism going to be enough to change the mood in the country?
Well, so the other thing which is going on here, which I wrote about for the LRB last summer, which is the rise of short form video and clips as the kind of paradigmatic media of the public sphere as it's becoming. I mean, if you want an example of that, I read the other day that the Today programme was going to start diverting more resources to the production of short clips, recognising that if it doesn't do that, then it's going to gradually just get left behind by demographic change as much as anything else. And Burnham is way better at that kind of presentation. Not quite as good as Mamdani maybe, but and maybe there's a certain, it's quite easy, not easy, but it's that way of being the kind of authentic figure walking the streets. I mean, the clips that Mamdani's campaign was able to produce of him wandering around New York high-fiving people and buying bagels and stuff was just sort of superb. And Burnham's campaign launch video had a similar vibe of people waving at him in the street and the Oasis playing in the background and that kind of thing. So it's perhaps easier for a municipal mayor to present themselves like that in the world of short form video. It will become harder, obviously, as he has to spend more time doing things like meeting heads of state and doing other. And of course, there will be scandals. I can't predict what those will be. There will be events that attach themselves to him. He will have to go on the defensive increasingly about various things, and none of that works well in this world of short form videos where you have just enough time to say whose fault something is, and not much time to explain it beyond that. So I think that's there's something has changed in the nature of our politics, and I think that Starmer was rather kind of flat-footed in relation to all of that stuff. In terms of the rage you're talking about, I don't think that. I mean, Burnham himself. I mean, clearly he seems to be more of a kind of human being in various respects, partly because of his greater ability to be relaxed in those sorts of clips than Starmer. But in terms of the rage itself, I mean that remains present, and I think lots of. From what I read about the local elections in May, there was genuine shock at the sheer vitriol and hatred for the political system, for the politicians of the London political classes, and this is coming from people who are also at the same time, to some extent, giving up on what might be called the mainstream media and are getting their sense of the world through various forms of. I mean, okay, you can talk about Elon Musk. A lot of what he's doing is just signal boosting stuff that's going on elsewhere, but also from the world of something that I've been quite interested in some of my work of kind of reaction videos and these kind of talking heads who, well, rather we're doing now, but in rather calmer ways. But sort of people who are sort of emoting about the state of the world to provide people with their with their orientation towards it. And I don't know, it's very difficult. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of honeymoon Burnham gets. It'll be interesting to see to what extent people expect to feel change and not just kind of be told change. I do think that one of the things that Starmer, there was something rather kind of outdated about the way Starmer's pledges when he came to office. All these things like the highest growth in the G7 and safer streets. There was a lot of quite Blairite rhetoric that I think in some ways reminded people of false promises in the past. Whereas that's not quite the sort of rhetoric that Burnham is using. I think turning towards devolution and talking about where power lies in society does feel quite fresh. But whether or not in 6 months' time there is people saying, "You said you were going to get power out of London. Well, where is it? I don't see it around here. Look at my high street. Look at the fact that I've still got no ability to, reopen these shops or this cafe or this pub and that kind of thing." Because that's the mood, of course, that is driving Farageism. And that's the mood that in this current information environment can be sort of ratcheted up and radicalized and weaponized by bad faith actors using platforms such as X.
I'm curious about your take, Patrick, just because I recall, I think, a few months ago when you were reporting and I think you tweeted something about Keir Starmer being despised and got quite a lot of pushback for so strong a word. But it's clearly is the feeling.
Yeah, look, I know exactly what you're talking about. It was the morning after the Gorton and Denton by-election, and I tweeted that the lesson was simple, that voters in Greater Manchester quite like Andy Burnham and they hate Keir Starmer. And there followed a massive discussion about the morality of a journalist saying a politician was hated. And to which my response was, and is, that is the word that is most often used by the Labour MPs who bear the brunt of this guy. It is not an endorsement, and often people say, "Oh, how can you possibly hate Keir Starmer? He's so bland, he's so inoffensive. There's nothing to hate." I think that is partly the reason why. Bishop James Jones, Andy Burnham sort of alluded to in his speech, who chaired the Hillsborough Independent Panel, came up with this phrase. It was the title of this report. It was the patronising disposition of unaccountable power. And a Labour MP once said to me, the problem with Keir Starmer was that he reminds people of the worst teacher they had, a traffic warden, an officious policeman pulling you over for going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, a social worker. He seemed to embody unfairly, I think, to some degree, because he was, always critical of state agencies as a barrister. He seemed to embody that what Andy Burnham would call the unaccountable state. He was a sort of functionary. He was a bureaucrat. And thus he was never going to get credit on the substance. Lots of it, if you transplanted this government to continental Europe, it would be, in many cases, a sort of straight up and down social democratic government, right? It's taking the railways back into public ownership. It's recognised the state of Palestine. It's levied higher taxes on business, etc., etc. So maybe that is all. Maybe that is all the Labour Party needs to reunite the progressive bloc of voters. Is it just Andy Burnham emerges, acknowledges, unlike Keir Starmer, and in a way Keir Starmer never could, that this is a government of the centre left that is making a series of trade-offs, and that there are losers. Right? This was a government that spent a lot of time speaking out of both sides of its mouth. It would say to progressives that. It would say to business, we're a pro-business government. It would say to voters on the right, we're really hardline on X, Y, Z, and progressives wouldn't like it, but it was unconvincing to everyone. And maybe Andy Burnham saying, actually, we are a government, we are making these trade-offs, sort of becoming sort of Britain's Pedro Sanchez is as unconvincing as that may sound, is probably the Labour Party's best bet, and actually relies on that big change in personality we've all been speaking about, and presentation and affect, as you said, James, rather than a radical change of substance.
I have a final question for you both, and it's about sort of known unknowns in one sense, right? To use that Rumsfeldian schema, very useful one. Burnham's going to come into power in the middle of next month. What's the first big decision that, for both of you, will give you a really strong sense of what direction this government is going to go in? So what are you looking for in terms of the first big policy decision? Patrick, I'll start with you.
Well, the defining one, and everything else is sort of before the Lord Mayor's show, as it were, is the budget. What are the big fiscal choices he is taking, and how is he explaining them? I mean, he has made repeated gestures towards tax cuts for business, particularly small and medium-sized business, and a sort of place-based and place-conscious tax cuts. Business rates for hospitality is a crucial one. He's shown he said he's sympathetic to the case for reversing the hike in employers' national insurance as well. So, the upshot of all the place-based politics is that it identifies something that is the locomotive force of populism, which is voters in deep England who feel that things are worse than they used to be. And that might not necessarily mean they're objectively poor or whatever. It is the downwardly mobile, aspirational middle class. It is the petit bourgeois, right? It's the locomotive force of every populist movement ever. Can he make good, and can he make the sums add up on a fiscal offer that is a prescription for the perennial diagnosis that those people offer of why their lives are bad, or why the country's going to the dogs? And it's striking that he mentioned high streets in that speech as well. He said that let that be the test of his government. So, is he willing to override Treasury orthodoxy or Treasury advice and say, no, we are doing this, we are making these tax cuts, and who loses as a result? Who loses? Is it multinationals? Is it Amazon? Is it, or is it, a new tax on wealth? Property taxes as well. Stamp duty, council tax is another one, right? So, that for me will be the first big crunchy tax decisions. Are the big ones for me.
I mean, I would say similarly that, clearly fiscal policy, despite the fact that I've said that I think if the success depends partly on the extent to which he's able to find himself outside of fiscal policy, there are clearly going to be these major dilemmas. The one that sprung to mind for me, first of all, was the one of welfare spending, which is not going to go away as an issue. And of course, the Labour Party does not identify as a party that cuts the size of the welfare state or the generosity of the welfare state. But I noticed that the Milburn review of NEET, the Not in Employment, Education or Training Young People, of which there's a million nearly a million in our society at the moment, has received a lot of attention. And I think Burnham has already signalled that he wants to act quite urgently on this. I think in some ways it's a kind of barometer of what kind of progressive party you're going to be, to what extent, in what ways are you going to bring young people back into society? Because there's one reading of that review, the Milburn Review, which is that we simply need to sort of start to cajole people back into the labour market through various forms of conditionality and threats and a little bit of cajoling and coaching and that kind of thing, which is not one that the left would sign up for. The question, it'd be interesting to think about whether there's a different reading of that review, which actually is, regardless of what some people might think about Alan Milburn, it's actually a very humane document in lots of ways in terms of its sympathy for the conditions that many young people find themselves in terms of their health and mental health. And I think there'll be, I find it very interesting to think a bit about what might a reading of that and a response to that be that wasn't simply about the return to conditionality and the empowering of various health inspectors and this sort of thing, because it's undoubtedly quite a major sort of social and cultural crisis in our society, and it requires innovative responses, not just more of those from the 2010s.
That's really interesting. A sort of maybe a devolved jobs guarantee program. Well, I mean, I think that's probably the right place for us to leave it. Well, Patrick, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can, of course, read Will Davies' piece on Andy Burnham's political economy in the new issue of the London Review of Books. Alongside that piece, you will find Marina Warner on Celia Paul, Patrick Coburn on Ireland, Colin Burrow on pedantry, and Owen Hatherley on anti-fascist art, among many, many others. Thanks for listening.